Welcome to this, my 16th LinkedIn Live broadcast, where I'm sharing work-winning tips around bids, tenders, and proposals. So today I want to speak about the subject of bidding successfully to Scottish-based organisations. And while I'm going to be talking mainly about bidding for public sector contracts, of which there's about £12 billion per annum awarded by Scottish-based public sector organisations, many of the points that I'm going to make would apply equally if you're bidding to a private sector organisation based in Scotland. It's very definitely not just a case when you're bidding in Scotland that a bid that you've used elsewhere in the UK can just have the names changed and hey presto, you've got a successful bid for a Scottish-based organisation. I'm going to talk in this LinkedIn Live broadcast about the differences that exist between Scotland and the rest of the UK and how these need to be recognised within any bid that you're considering submitting to Scotland. It's not uncommon for particularly large UK organisations to have headquarters perhaps in London or in the home counties or Midlands or even large English northern cities. And that's where they have the bid team, and that bid team is serving the whole of the UK. That can sometimes cause some difficulties with particular Scottish-based bidding. What difficulties? Well, unless you have got very good contacts with your staff who are based in Scotland and making sure that they are reading the bids, they're getting to contribute to them, and they can particularly sense check them for Scottish-based differences and nuances, then you're not going to be as successful as you could be if perhaps you were to consider getting Scottish-based bid specialists to actually assist you with your bids. So it's very much not just change the names on your bid to somewhere else in the UK, and that will hold good for Scotland. So what are the main differences with Scottish-based bidding? And some of the things that I'm going to talk about could also have a resonance perhaps to Welsh-based bidding or bidding to Northern Ireland or Republic of Ireland, clearly is a completely different country. Well, Scotland has got its own government and it's had that now for just over 20 years. So there is the Scottish government. So be careful as well if you're talking in your bids about the government. Are you referring to the UK government or the Scottish government? So it is important to understand that that difference does apply. Scotland, of course, also has got its own laws. It's got its own legislation. So be careful that any legislation that you're referring to within your bid or proposal is the Scottish legislation. Of course, some UK-wide legislation exists, and if it's a UK-wide legislation, that's fine. But be careful because much of the legislation is actually Scottish specific. And that applies as well in procurement. So Scotland's got its own procurement legislation. And one of the important differences with the Scottish procurement legislation is that the value of what has to go through a full tender process within public sector bidding is much lower in Scotland. It is 50,000, any bid that is for any contract that's for worth more than 50,000. So that's even something that's just 15,000 a year for 4 years. That would be 60,000. So that would have to go through a fully advertised public sector procurement process. Of course, the figure across the rest of the UK is nearly 4 times that. Because the rest of the UK is using the European Union thresholds for bidding. That's bidding to perhaps like public sector bodies, to local authorities, etc. The figure, if it's to the NHS trust or central government figure, is a bit lower. across the rest of the UK, but still substantially more than 50,000. In Scotland, it's 50,000 across the board for goods or services contracts. So what does the Scottish Government have within its ambit in Scotland? What is it caring for and have responsibility for? Well, health, education, legal and justice system, housing and planning, farming and forestry, culture and the arts, and water regulation. And in more recent years, the Scottish Government is also transitioning and handling welfare benefits as well. It's not quite doing them all at the moment, but it's doing many of them. And gradually, these welfare benefits administration and indeed the policies that they flow from, the responsibility for that is being transferred to the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament. So very important that any bids that you're doing to the public sector, where they need to have reference to legislation, shows a clear understanding of the Scottish legislation and also which bodies in Scotland would have the accountability for that as well. So regulation, for example, is going to be different bodies for much of the regulatory system in Scotland compared to other parts of the UK. So what next can we talk about? Well, we can talk about the geography of Scotland. What's different about that? Well, Scotland probably only has perhaps between 10 and 12% or maybe even less than 10% of the population of the UK, but it does have 60% of the land area of England. So what you've got is a vast country, really, a vast geography, but quite a small population. And quite a lot of that population is contained within the so-called Central Belt. And that's the sort of area between Glasgow and Edinburgh and perhaps 10 or 20 miles basically north and south of that route, you would say, which is the M8 motorway, goes between these two cities. So the central belt of Scotland is also going to be quite different to the rural parts of Scotland. And Scotland also has over 90 inhabited islands. So if you're looking at bidding for a national contract in Scotland, particularly one that is perhaps on behalf of the Scottish Government or Scottish public sector body, they're going to look for, well, how are you going to deliver this contract to everybody who potentially could need it in Scotland? What's your service delivery going to be like in the Highlands and Islands? And just taking Highland Council as an example, Inverness, Aviemore, Fort William, and away up to the very north of Scotland, Highland Council, you're talking about the land area of Highland Council is larger than the whole of Wales, in the land area of Wales. Also, with quite a lot of parts of Scotland, I mentioned about the islands, you're talking about ferries, so you might be dependent on ferries and whether the ferries are running. And of course, we get Scottish winter weather as well, which can sometimes be quite extreme. We have snow gates in Scotland, and these snow gates basically mean that roads get closed because they're impassable due to the amount of snow that's on them. That's particularly much more likely up in the north of Scotland. We don't see so much of that down within the Central Belt. But important that your organisation understands that and understands some of the unique nature of what service delivery would be like if you're looking at a contract that was pan-Scotland, that was going right across the whole of Scotland. Just on that point as well, if you are looking at a national contract, then do you have to have staff in all the islands? It probably wouldn't be necessarily feasible. but how would you deliver a service there? Well, what a lot of organisations successfully do is they find out that on the islands there are some local men and women who can actually usually do a number of trades or perform a number of services on an as-needed basis. Inevitably, not all the services are needed at the very same time. So the same person who's perhaps doing a delivery might also be doing some kind of facilities management function, could be a qualified repairer of something as well. So you find out, you need a bit of local knowledge to find out who these people are, because that's going to play out very well within your bid. It's going to mean that your cost of delivery is going to be less, because you're not necessarily having to get people across to islands, usually by ferries, sometimes by plane, that instead you're going to be able to actually have these services delivered locally. And the local service delivery by local people, of course, that's going to help within your bid. It's going to mean that these communities are going to be a bit more sustainable because local people are being employed. It also means that the response times are going to be quicker as well, because the people carrying out the service are not necessarily going to be dependent on ferries, etc., but they're still going to be able to be on the ground delivering the service. And of course, that plays out very well in the social value aspects of your bid. And here's another difference between Scotland and other parts of the UK, is that in Scotland, social value is called community benefits. So it's very similar to what perhaps in England you'd be looking at as social value, but in Scotland it is called community benefits. And it is the usual themes that we see within social value around local jobs, local apprenticeships, local supply chains, support for local community organisations. So you would want to have your finger on the pulse of the local situation, so as what you're offering is relevant to that particular organisation, and more importantly even the communities it is serving. So it might not be enough that nationally, maybe across the whole of the UK, you're doing a particular thing around charitable support, because the public sector buyer in Scotland is going to be looking at, well, what does this mean for our local area? And also, very importantly, with social value or community benefits, what is the additionality? What new opportunities are there going to be? What new spend is there going to be on community projects because you have got this contract? It's not enough to just package up what you're already doing. They're going to be looking at, well, if you get awarded this contract, what is that going to mean in our local communities? And as I say quite often on the subject of social value or community benefits, vital that you quantify what you're going to be doing. You're probably going to tie this to contract or framework spend, so as you're not making commitments that there's not the equivalent contract spend coming along with it. You want outcomes that are smart. They need to be specific and measurable, etc. You want to say how you're going to report on them and monitor them as well. So having a very good community benefits offering will definitely help you within your bids to the Scottish public sector. Just watch as well that the terminology in Scotland can often be quite different to what it is in other parts of the UK. So what do we mean by that? Well, if we take local government, so in Scotland there are unitary councils. That's all there are. All 32 councils are unitary councils, which means that they're responsible for all local government services. So we don't have what we necessarily see in some other parts of the UK around, city councils, metropolitan borough councils, county councils, parish councils. There isn't any of that in Scotland. So in Scotland, each council is a unitary authority responsible for all local government services. I mean, sometimes they will partner up, and they might partner up perhaps to put a contract out to tender. So you might be doing this for a few councils at the same time. Generally, they do their own procurement, although they do have a national purchasing body for goods and services that really all councils are likely to need. And that body is called Scotland Excel. EXCEL, and a very, very good body that put contracts, national frameworks out to tender, and often these can have regional geographical lots within them as well. The position of higher education, of course, in Scotland is quite different to England as well. There are not student fees for Scottish or European Union-based students, so there's not student fees. But the higher education bodies in Scotland very much part of the public sector and carry out their procurements accordingly. So sometimes it's individual universities and colleges conducting the procurements, but there's also the national purchasing body for them called APUC, the Association of Purchasing for Universities and Colleges. So again, some of these national frameworks can be very interesting. The NHS terminology in Scotland is different as well. So there is, obviously central government have got oversight of the NHS in Scotland, the Scottish government, but they have some devolution of powers to the individual boards. So there's 14 Scottish NHS boards. So importantly, they're not called trusts in Scotland. So don't talk about NHS trusts. They don't exist in Scotland. They are NHS boards. There's also, again, an umbrella body that can purchase on behalf of them all, and that's in National Shared Services. So that's NSS Scotland. The Scottish Government also will do procurement for their own goods and services. Sometimes they will use the UK-wide Crown Commercial Service frameworks, but often the opportunities will be tendered out by Scottish procurement for the Scottish Government. In terms of social housing in Scotland, there are no such thing as arm's length management organisations. Not so many of them now. Quite a lot of them have gone back into the local authority from which they came, but there are none in Scotland. So the social housing in Scotland is either under the control of the local authority or it's housing associations. There are some tenant management cooperatives as well within Scotland. So important to just understand again the terminology, and just on the schools as well. There are no academy schools within Scotland. So in Scotland, the schools are all state schools or private schools. So there isn't that kind of academy schools within Scotland either. So one thing it's important to recognise is the sensitivities that exist within Scotland as well. So there will be sensitivities for Scottish-based evaluators if you were continually talking about what you're doing in other parts of the UK. These things can be used as reference points, but they are going to want to see that you've done the thinking about how you would deliver this contract within Scotland. So it might be good to cite some other Scottish experience that you might have, or Scotland-based staff. So if, for example, let's say you were doing a bid to one of the large city councils in Scotland, there are 7 city councils, but if I take the largest 2, Glasgow and Edinburgh, so if you were doing a bid to one of these councils, but you'd never done work for them before, but you've done work elsewhere in Scotland, then you would want to make some reference to that to show that you understand what is needed to deliver work successfully within Scotland. However, I would also balance that by saying that evaluators are also interested in the relevance as well. So if you have delivered work in one of the large English cities, then that would be good to reference that as well. You know, if you were talking about Manchester or Leeds or Birmingham or Bristol, then all of that could be quite relevant as well to delivering a contract for perhaps Glasgow or Edinburgh Council, because you'd have experience of what is needed to deliver a contract successfully to a very large city council. So I'm not saying that the experience gained elsewhere in the UK doesn't count. It's just important that you make the relevant connections, that you articulate these clearly within their bid. So other things about bidding in Scotland, of course, there was a referendum in 2014. It is possible that there will be another referendum at some point in the future years. And if you're bidding on a contract that is for a number of years, then perhaps you're also going to be thinking about, well, what would happen if there was another referendum, and if next time round Scotland voted to separate from the rest of the UK. Then in that case, then you'd have to be thinking about, well, what effect could that have on the delivery of the service? What even if there was to be a completely new currency within the country? Now, of course, nobody's got all of the answers to what would happen there, but it's important that if you're submitting a bid that's going to last for a number of years, that you show that you've done at least some of the thinking, that you're aware that these things could happen, and that you've done a bit of thinking around the any consequences for the contract you're delivering, and that would certainly sit well. I would say in Scotland as well, it's important that you, if you're within your bid, it's important that you are politically neutral as well, because these things are fairly finely balanced between people who are in favour or not in favour. So important that you walk a fine line there as well. And also that you recognise that in Scotland, you know, we're talking about a large percentage of the population live within a very short space of each other. They meet each other quite often. Of course, now it's more virtually. A lot of people know each other in Scotland, or you know somebody who knows somebody. So reputation is very important in Scotland as well. It also works the other way as well for Scotland-based organisations that are bidding in England, because of course bidding in England and other parts of the UK is going to be a bit different to bidding in Scotland. And even some of the terminology is interesting. So I heard of one bidder that had been speaking about time served tradespeople that would be working on the contracts. And this was a Scottish-based bidder who was bidding down to England. Actually, what does time served mean? Time served tradesperson? Well, in England, it tends to mean that they've done time in prison. So that raised a bit of a concern with a buyer that there was a proper criminal checks being done, etc., rehabilitation, etc., etc. But of course, that was not what the Scottish-based bidder meant. In Scotland, time served means that a tradesperson has served their time. They've served their apprenticeship, usually 3 or 4 years, and then we speak about time-served plumbers and time-served electricians. But of course, south of the border, this time-served more has a connotation of having done time within prison. So again, just terminology and nuances are quite important as well. So I'm saying that in summary, the moral is that if you're spending time and effort bidding on contracts based in Scotland for Scottish-based public sector organisations and private sector ones too, it may be worth considering getting your bids looked at first of all in Scotland before they are submitted. Perhaps getting a bid specialist in to review your bids and what you're doing and give you tips on how you can bid more successfully for a share of that £12 billion per annum public sector contracts in Scotland that go out to tender. So I hope you found this useful. Great to see some comments from people that have found it of benefit. Tomorrow, I'm going to go LinkedIn Live at 12 noon again. And this time I'm going to be talking about losing bids on price, reversing that trend, how to reverse the trend if you find that you're losing bids on price. So hope to see you tomorrow at 12 noon.